you've probably studied and have heard or know a lot of the things I might talk about, but I wanted to talk this time about the Buddha's, his essential teaching, which are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And everything else that he talked about over a 45-year period of teaching is all inside of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And I heard a number, or read a number recently that he gave 1,760 talks. And I don't have any idea if that number's right. And a lot of times we talk about there are 84,000 teachings, and I don't know if that number's right. So between the two, but there are many, many books of the Buddha's teachings because he did have such a long time as a teacher. So from the time he was 35 until he died at 80, he was teaching all the way through. So we have a lot of his talks, and they're all, they can all fit back into the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So I asked this question at the temple a few weeks ago, and so most hands were raised. It was a big audience on a Saturday, and a lot of hands were raised. People who had taken the precepts and who, thought kind of considered themselves Buddhist, or they were actively studying. And then I asked if they knew the Four Noble Truths, and nobody wanted to volunteer talking about it. So, and I'd asked that a few other times, and I realized we can teach for a long time and people can practice, and sometimes we're not quite exactly sure what the Buddha, what he was talking about. So to me, the Four Noble Truths, when I first became interested in Buddhism, it was in the Shambhala tradition. So at the center, there was a chart with all of the numbered list of the Buddha. It was a whole bunch of them, a real beautiful chart. And the Four Noble Truths were in there, but I never heard anybody for 8 years talk about the Four Noble Truths. And I think in our Theravadan tradition, we come back to those earliest teachings all the time. That's our body of wisdom that we work with, those original teachings of the Buddhas. And we still maybe we don't focus on that enough. And I kind of like being able to take everything and not condense it, but to see how it works at the core, because there are so many teachings. So it's good to remind ourselves sometimes how this particular teaching relates back to what we know is the core. After the Buddha became enlightened, and I'll talk a little bit about that, he was talking to some of his students not too long after his enlightenment, and they were talking about questions, and some of the questions were things that the Buddha didn't really answer, or he didn't have, he would just kind of not answer a question. And then one day he was talking to some students, and he grabbed a handful of leaves, and they were by some bushes, and he asked his students, he said, are there more leaves in my hand or in the bushes? And they said, well, of course, more in the bushes. And he said his entire life, he knew life was short, and he had what we would think of as a really long career as a Buddha. But he said, what I can teach is like this handful of leaves, just because there's not enough time. And there's a lot more about the world and the reality of the world. But what he wanted to teach, what he had discovered for himself during the process of his enlightenment, was for him like those leaves. And so that was his focus. So there are a lot of questions he didn't answer, a lot of things that people speculate about that he said that's not really part of what the thing that he discovered, the thing he wanted to search for was, do we suffer? Is suffering all that we can look forward to? Is life only about suffering? And he got the answer to that, and through his insight and really putting a lot of effort and focus into it, he got the truth of the truth of suffering, and that's what he formulated, and then he thought and contemplated more and developed the Eightfold Path. And so that was the handful of leaves that he wanted to talk about. That was the wisdom he hadn't been able to find in the world up until the time he discovered it for himself during meditation. And so I think that's why it's so important, because everything else he taught, we should be able to connect it back to, right back to the Four Noble Truths. So it doesn't have to be confusing, it's not too esoteric that it doesn't make any sense. So what I'd like to start out with is just sharing with you a little bit about the Buddha's background and how he came to do what he did. So the story has to start before the Buddha was born. So he was born into a culture, of course, that already believed in rebirth or reincarnation, was what it was called by some different groups. But the cosmology was already set in India, and the Buddha never messed with the existing cosmology. That wasn't in the handful of leaves. So he accepted in his teaching even the existing cosmology, because that helped him explain things that people could relate to and understand without getting off the track. But the Buddha, in his own personal story, he was actually a perfected Bodhisattva. And so before he was born in his life as Sakyamuni, well, he was born as Siddhartha Gautama. And before he was born, he told students later he had lived many, 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 many thousands of lives, and he had been able to see those lives when he was the night he stayed awake and had different experiences to become enlightened. And so he could see that he had been through all these thousands of lives, he had perfected the qualities of a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is a being that has committed to helping all other living beings to reach nibbana, or to reach the end of the samsaric wheel, by help until they won't get off the wheel themselves until they can take everyone with them. So in the Buddha's time, a bodhisattva was considered just a being, a sentient being who had perfected 10 qualities. And the Buddha had perfected those, and then when he came back in his lifetime as Siddhartha Gautama, he was ready to take on the mantle of being an embodied Buddha, a teaching Buddha. So let me tell you a little bit about the Bodhisattva has completely perfected 10 qualities. And they do it through living all these different long lives, and some short lives, but they're constantly developing. And I'll tell you the 10. I don't think I'll even use the Pali words unless you are really excited about Pali. And I'm trying to learn. The monks taught me a little kind of childhood way to memorize the 10 perfections, but I won't sing that for you. So the 10 qualities are, and we still have, at our temple, we do when we do the precepts once a year, there are people who have been studying for a long time, and they actually take the Bodhisattva vow. And that's kind of like lifetime after lifetime precepts. But it's the same set of 10 qualities. And they just keep working and perfecting these qualities. So generosity is the first one, and a really very important one, because I think generosity is the quality of giving of yourself. So not only is it it's kind of you're kind of getting rid of the self in a way. You're letting go of things, but it's also giving it to others who can benefit from it. Generosity and morality, which is the Buddha considered our ethical behavior, and morality is a foundation of all his other teachings. So that's something that he felt to have the determination and the intention to follow the spiritual path that he had discovered. We need that foundation of our behavior being kind of rock solid to give us what we needed, the energy we needed, and the peace of mind we needed. And then renunciation. And renunciation can involve becoming more compassionate and having more loving kindness, and letting go of negative qualities, letting go of unwholesome qualities. And it can also mean like being a renunciate, like a monastic would be. But it's all of us can kind of simplify things, kind of let go of things that make life, give us a little bit more energy in our lives when we throw some things overboard, Wisdom and effort, which is very important, because that's the effort it takes to stay on a path and to just keep going. And the Buddha talked a lot about energy and effort and determination, because it's not always easy, and the world is pulling us another way. So the world is always pulling us to, you've done that for 6 weeks, that ought to be enough to, are you still doing that meditation thing? Or are you still doing your Tai Chi? So that we've never had a world that gave a lot of support to a spiritual path. And so the Buddha knew it would take a lot of energy for anyone to pursue it. Patience and forbearance. So patience includes not only being patient, but that quality includes, basically it includes forgiveness, that forbearance. If we stick around long enough, we can forgive a lot of things, right? If we're patient and can stay with something and let go of ourself and stay there, it ends up being forgiveness in many, many cases. So those two go together. And the next one is truthfulness. And the next is determination. So the 10 perfections have effort and determination. So a lot of, it's not like hard work, but it's sticking power, the determination to not give up, if you have questions, to have your questions answered and keep going. Don't if you get sidetracked, you can always go back. You don't have to give up and quit or lose confidence in yourself. And then loving kindness, which we talk about a lot in our meditation in Buddhism. And then the last one, which is often considered the most difficult, is equanimity or balance. So it's someone said they thought equipoise was a better word, and I thought that doesn't mean any more than equanimity does, right? So equanimity to me just means there is poise in it, because it's being balanced with our emotional states and being balanced with We take the good, but we take the bad. You know, we're always kind of flowing from one to the other, but we're trying to stay balanced. Not overreact to the good and not overreact to the bad, and find that the Buddha, we talk about the middle path. Buddhism is the middle path, and that equanimity sums it up for the person. But it also, for the Buddha, meant we don't go to extremes with our spiritual practices. Because if it's too extreme, if you're starving yourself or you're not sleeping, you can't have the right state of mind to have a good meditation. And he showed himself that in the years that he practiced a lot of austerities. And if we indulge and we're too wrapped up in comfort and everything being easy, that's not good either, because then those qualities that we need to stay with it are not there. So equanimity with our emotional states, I think, is one of the last things that anyone on a path finally arrives at completely. So the Buddha came into this his lifetime as Gautama, having already accomplished all of the perfection of these qualities. And so he was already probably more advanced than most of us would even want to suggest at all. So he came in he was well developed for the job that he took on. So those qualities, you'll hear them talked about a lot. So I wanted to talk about the night of his enlightenment. And, most of us know the story that he was the son of a very wealthy, not exactly a king, but like a ruler of the Sakyan clan. So he was a powerful, kind of like not quite a governor, but not quite a king, because the countryside was built up of all these small kingdoms. So his father was the head of that clan and the military top leader. And so he was, I will call him a king because it's easier. We don't have the right word for what his position was. So when his wife was pregnant with a child, he wanted everything to be set up so if this child was a boy, he would become his father's, the next ruler. He'd take his father's place. And there were no other sons at this point for him to have in that position. So the Buddha was born, and there's a beautiful story with that, and there are all kinds of beautiful pieces of art that talk about the story. His mother was going back to her home area. Her parents were rulers in another area, and she went into, well, she didn't really have a labor. We can't call it that. It was a little different. So she had to stop in Lumbini and had to have the baby was coming. So but the pictures of her, if you see drawings of her having the baby, she's standing up with a beautiful traveling gown on, and she's holding on to a tree just very comfortably, and the baby is coming out of her side. So it's, and she had a dream before he was born that an elephant, a white elephant, kind of flew over her and then sort of flew into her, like right through her front. And that was a good dream. It was, I don't know exactly what she thought about it, but it didn't trouble her. So her delivery, when she had the baby, there was no pain. It was very calm and peaceful. And then you'll see other pictures of the baby Buddha, the baby with a little like a little toga usually on. And he immediately after he was born, he took steps. And everywhere he stepped, a big lotus would come up. And so and then you'll see the little baby always has his hand pointing up. And when we go to a lot of temples, they have a ceremony where they bathe the baby Buddha. So they have that Buddha in a bowl of water, and people will come up and pour scoops of water on the Buddha. And it's a lovely ceremony. So I think one year we borrowed some of the decorations from one of the temples that there are, like a brother temple, a sister temple. And we had the little Buddhas in our garden outside, and it was a different tradition, but it was a beautiful thing. And now at our winter New Year's service, we do the bathing ceremony with the baby. I think ours is not a baby Buddha, is it though? It's a little statue of a full-grown Buddha, but he's in a pitcher of a basin of water, and everybody pours the water over him. So we're creating new traditions as we go in this country. So we share from each other. So we're like the Theosophical Society or the Unitarians. We're interested in what everybody else is doing too, and sharing the things we have in common, and appreciating the things that people do that are really very different from us. So back to the night of his enlightenment. So after the Buddha was born, there was an old ascetic who came to the babies, what would be like the babies, maybe the christening or a party the parents were having for the baby being born. But the sage told them that their son would either be a great ruler, a wheel-turning king, so be a very, very famous ruler, or he would be a great sage, so he would be a holy man. And his dad didn't like that. That wasn't in his plan for his son. So then he made sure that his son never saw things outside of the world that he could construct very beautifully for him. So his son would grow up and not be attracted to the outside, outside the palace. So then right after that, the Buddha's mom died just 7 days after he was born. And his mother's sister, Mahapajapati, raised him and actually became the first nun after the Buddha, 5 years after the Buddha began teaching. So the Buddha grew up, and he did make it outside the palace, so he did see what was really going on in the rest of the world. So he saw that people got sick, and he saw that people died, before they died, he saw they grew old and weak and lost their teeth and had to walk with canes, and then he saw that they also died. And he was pretty shaken up by that, because that was not the kind of world he was able to live in. And then the fourth thing that he saw was an ascetic. So it would have been a monk there were many different sects and groups that were practicing in India at that time. So wandering monks or teachers or gurus would have not been uncommon. But when he saw that person, it made him feel better. He saw this peaceful person, just kind of maybe just a silhouette of this monk, this ascetic. And he saw, that looks like that person is peaceful and calm and seems free. So he made the determination at that point that he needed to find out about suffering. And if those were the things that life was about, he wanted to find out, is there a way out of that? Is there a way people can actually be happy in this world? Is there mainly what can we do about this suffering problem? So the word that we use when we talk about the Buddha's enlightenment is a word for suffering is dukkha, but its suffering is not the best translation. Dukkha covers a lot. Dukkha covers everything from just being a little irritated or dissatisfied with, say, your meal, or unhappy that maybe it's too cool or not cool enough in here for you. It can be all those little kind of irritants where things aren't just right, and it bothers us that they're not. And it can be all the way up to really profound suffering and persecution and being victimized and things that all of us would recognize as suffering. But it also, it also means, when we talk about dukkha, it covers so many things. I find that all the time I add on to what that means. So some people will try to list the things that might be how we could define dukkha, but it's better to just use the word dukkha and think about that, like everything that we don't want, or losing the things that we do love, having to be with people that we're not crazy about, maybe the people we work with or people in our neighborhood, and not being able to be with the people we love. So it's anything that's really pleasurable and wonderful is not going to be that way forever. So dukkha really covers everything that is is in this world, because everything is impermanent. So no matter how good things get, they're impermanent, right? You can be, and the weather changes, but our moods change a lot more rapidly. So you might wake up in the morning feeling really great, and somebody says something to you the minute you walk into your office or walk into the kitchen, and suddenly you don't feel so good anymore. And it might be the person you love the most, or the colleague that you enjoy the most, or it might be something you heard on the news on the radio. So we can be happy one minute and we can be suffering the next. So the nature of this world is that all conditioned things, all things that are made up of other things, that all of those are impermanent. And so impermanence is the base of what makes suffering a part of our world, a part of our life. Because we'll lose everything that we love, and we'll lose our youth, we'll grow old, and we'll get sick, and we'll die. So we never stay the same. Everything is also in constant change. And that in itself is discomforting. It's not comfortable to know that our hair's turning gray, or our eyes are getting weaker. Those things don't make us, they're not real cheerful to think about. I've solved the gray hair problem. Although I keep pulling on them to see if they're gray or not. They are gray, but I can't tell. So just the nature of reality can set us up for suffering. Things are always changing, and then things are impermanent. People are impermanent. Our work is impermanent. Our governments are impermanent. Now we've got global warming, so even our climate is changing, and that's not fun to think about much of the time. So all those things are the things that create dissatisfaction or discomfort with us. So all those things can create suffering. So the Buddha's task was to find out about suffering, and if there was a way out of it, was not a little inconsequential quest. It was a big one. So he grew up, And when he saw these things, it made him think more and more about the real nature of the world. He made the decision to become a renunciate, and he left the palace, and he left his wife and his child. And the child later became one of his monks. His name was but he was named Rahula, which means a fetter. So I think the Buddha knew what he was about to do when he named his son. I have a feeling maybe he and his wife both knew what he was going to do. But he gave up his family, who were, of course, living in a palace, so they were well taken care of and had lots of family. But he was letting go of them for the greater, his love for them and for the world was great enough that I think he felt that what he would be doing if he could answer these questions would be to be of more help than staying at the palace and hanging around there would be. So difficult decision, but he was willing to do it for their benefit and for the benefit of all other living beings. So what he did, he spent 6 years going to different teachers who were well known for being some of the best teachers, some of these groups of ascetics, and they were everywhere. It was a really rich, fertile time in India then for ideas and thinking and looking at the world in different ways or expanding on what they knew. So he went to he talks about two of the teachers he went to, and they were the ones he considered they had the best reputations, good followers, and he pretty quickly learned everything they were teaching. And then both of them asked him after he finished their training. They said, "You've mastered all this. Would you stay with me, and then you can become my successor, because you really latched onto things fast." And both times the Buddha said, "No, I still haven't found the answer to what I was searching for." And so he left those teachers, and then he went to other teachers trying to get the answers. And then he finally decided he needed to work on his own. But before he worked all completely alone, found a group there were 5 other men who were drawn to him because he seemed like a good teacher to them. And so the 5 of them and Siddhartha they lived together. They'd be scattered around meditating, but they were a group. And they were practicing mortification of the body, so they were meditating, but they were also not eating, or maybe they got down to like a grain of rice a day with very little water, and all the austerities that their thinking was, and it was very common then and still is in India in places today, that if you could mortify the body, you could be released from the physical body, and you could find the answers then, because your spirit would be free from the limitations of the body. And so you could have a spiritual experience that would give you, this would give you what you were searching for. And so the Buddha became so thin and so weak, and he told some of his students later, he became so emaciated that if he pressed against his stomach, he could feel his spine. So, and there's some statues that you may see of the Buddha, and he's just literally skin and bones, and that was while he was in that period. And he realized that, I think he kind of came out of the trance of that experience and realized that he would die if he continued that before he found the answer to his question. And so he ate, and there are beautiful stories that are about how he ate and what he ate. But he ate, and he began to take care of himself and built up his health, and realized that if he was going to get the answer to his questions, he had to be able to have a clear mind, and he had to have, his health needed to be good enough that he could meditate and have a mind that was not, your mind would be, you would not have a sound mind if you were starving and if you were depriving yourself of sleep and water and food. So that's when he realized that whatever his path was going to be, it had to be balanced. So that's when his ideas about the middle path were beginning to be formulated, because he saw that either extreme is not going to work. And there were other groups that were, they went to the other extreme because their belief might be, there's no, when we die, we're just dead, so what we need to do is just enjoy this life. So they were teaching about going to the extreme of being just completely immersed in sensual pleasures and good food, and just enjoy this life to the fullest, because that's it. And that was a path that they were teaching people. So he came back when he first, when the 5 other ascetics who were with him saw that he had eaten food, and they thought, well, he gave up. He didn't have enough effort. His determination wasn't strong enough, and so they shunned him. So that's when he decided, now I'm really on my own, but I've eaten. I'm eating. I'm not neglecting taking care of my body that way, and I'm going to do this. I will meditate in this one spot until I find the answers. And that's when he sat down under what we now call a Bodhi tree here, but it was a Ficus religiosa. So that was they were real common there. And he sat down under the tree, which was typical for monks then and ascetics. They would find a tree, and that's where they would sit for the day. And that was the majority of their day. They'd get food, and if they were monks who were eating food, they'd get some food, and they would have their spot, and that might be where they'd stay for the rest of the day. So he sat for 6 days, and let me tell you about some of that process. He went through all of the meditative stages, and what that did was clean out the impurities in his mind. So it was like a final purification of anything, any kind of unwholesome mental thoughts or any kind of defilements in his mind. And when we say meditative stages, we just mean when we sit, when we go through meditative stages of absorption, they're sometimes called. It's basically that we're sitting, and they're called jhanas, but what they are is just we're sitting, we're calm and peaceful, and we continue to sit. And then we become more calm and more peaceful. This is my own interpretation, and I have not gone through all the jhanas, so I can't speak to them. But our sitting, there's no like ceremony or any kind of password or any kind of special thing you have to know or be told. But the more we sit and the more we calm our mind and the more our foundation of our morality and our behavior is solid, so our mind can be more spacious and we aren't filled with regrets and things that we worry about. Our meditation just becomes deeper, which really just means we become more still. Our mind becomes more quiet, and our body is relaxed, and we just go. We're not going deeper or higher, but we're just becoming more meditative. And that's when we have these stages that the Buddha talks about and taught his students about. And they're different. They're only we go through. There's a stage where you can go through bliss, but then that stage has to eventually be. You have to let go of that and not get caught up in that, and go on to another stage. And then you just keep going through those stages, realizing that they aren't permanent, but the beauties and the bliss that might come to you in one of those meditative stages may be at first it's very wonderful, and it would encourage someone to keep aiming for it. But if you get too comfortable in that stage, you can get stuck there. So it's better to just keep sitting. You just keep sitting and let that be a wonderful little oasis, but that's not the end. It's not the end of meditation, because we're basically moving through all those stages and just reaching a kind of equanimity where we're beyond like the pleasurable parts, and we're just going for a state of mind that I know I've never achieved. So, but those are the stages he went through that night. So he went through all of those stages and was kind of like just cleaning everything out, the last little bits that might have been there. Then he was able to recollect all of his past lives. And remember, he came into this life, that life, already having perfected all of those bodhisattva qualities. So he'd been through a lot of lives, and he could actually recollect those lives. And so that gave him a lot of understanding about a lot of stuff. You can imagine if you could suddenly visualize thousands of lifetimes, you could understand maybe why you have a predisposition to allergies, or why there are certain kinds of food you don't like, or why there might be certain people that when you met them you just really liked them right away, or other people you met and you didn't like them at all, and a lot of other more significant things. But it gave him, it opened a lot of understanding for him about the nature of the world too. And then he obtained a knowledge of all kinds of beings appearing and disappearing and reappearing. So he was able to just visualize the whole scan of the nature of life, the nature of how things rise and fall away and then come up again. So it was. This is all part of the process that then we call the whole thing his enlightenment. So he could see too that those beings that would appear and disappear, he could see in the visualization that they were sometimes ending up in good places, sometimes ending up in places that were not good. And then they'd come up again. And so he was watching them, watching karma. He was watching people, or karma. The Pali is kama and Sanskrit is karma. So he was watching that process of how the actions of people determine, what happens to them. Like it's a cause and effect. Like good actions lead to good results, and unwholesome actions eventually lead to unwholesome results. And then, but it kept going, it kept going. So then he wanted to, having gone through all that, his next thing was to focus his mind on the knowledge of the destruction of these taints or these problems. He wanted to study more about the problems behind sense pleasures and about this becoming over and over again that he had seen, and also about ignorance or delusion. So those became important parts of his teaching too. That some traditions call it the three poisons. So we're working with our desires to always keep coming back. We aren't tired of this wheel that we're on, and a lot of what we want to do is just keep coming back for more. Because we don't understand the nature of the world. So what he began to see and what came out of that, of directing his mind to the knowledge of, and this is what he said to his students later, the destruction of the taints. And what came out of that for him, and that he was meditating on this or contemplating at the end of all of these other experiences. And what came out of that for him was what he then called the Four Noble Truths. And then it becomes easy after he got to that point. So after he was enlightened, I want to share this with you because I think this is interesting. So after that night, and after he had developed the Four Noble Truths, and then he worked again on creating this eightfold path, which is always drawn in a circle. So if you often can see the image of a wheel with the spokes coming out, and each one of the parts of the eightfold path are in a part of in the spokes. So after that, he sat for a week just experiencing the bliss of having, been delivered, of having reached Nibbana. So he just had a week of sitting and being blissful. Which just, doesn't that sound wonderful? Then he thought over, then after that week, he thought over, and that's a quote, he thought over dependent arising, where because of one thing, something else arises, and then if that one thing goes away, the other thing goes away. So we think of it as cause and effect. So one thing happens and something else happens. And then when one thing stops, something stops. So he thought over that because that's what he was seeing. Then 6 more weeks he spent retreating, and he was alone, and he traveled around to 6 different spots. But he spent 6 weeks probably under 6 different trees, just being alone and spending his time meditating and probably walking and just thinking about everything, contemplating and thinking and meditating about everything he had experienced and putting it all together. And then he decided after all this time, because he wasn't really sure if he wanted to become a teacher, because he could just stay in that blissful, he could just do that until the end of his life. But he then decided he'd go back and try to, maybe he could teach his 5 friends. He could share with them because they'd been through a lot together, and maybe he could share with them what he had learned. And maybe he was thinking too, maybe he could try out how he'd put this, what he discovered if he could articulate it in a way that would be meaningful to them. So when he first went back, the monks thought, oh, here he comes, we're going to not pay attention to him. But he actually, as he walked towards them, he just radiated something that made them realize they wanted to talk to him. So he was healthy, he wasn't starving, so he was probably radiating from having eaten and having slept. But they thought he looked so changed and so different that they just couldn't help but want to talk to him. And they described his face was beautiful and his skin was glowing, and he actually had like an aura around him. So those 5 accepted his teachings very readily. And they quickly, because they had all been on this same path, but they could understand his teaching. And very quickly those 5 actually became enlightenment through their own work, but what the Buddha could then explain. He could explain to them what they had not been able to actually experience for themselves. And there were 60 monks, because another young, I think a nobleman who was probably someone who had known the Buddha, brought 55, he and 55 other men came and joined the Buddha and his first 5 students. So he pretty quickly had a group of 60. And then he lived again until he taught from then until he was 80. His students said that one of the things about him was that he always acted as he believed and as he taught. There was never a difference. And if you know the 4 sublime states, or the 4 Brahma Viharas, are the best 4 qualities. And this is true for any spiritual path. And those are loving kindness, and compassion, and sympathetic joy for others, and equanimity. So those qualities are considered supreme qualities, and all the students of the Buddha who talked about him said that he embodied those qualities. So even during his ministry, during the 45 years he taught, his teachings were so well received that universities for training monastics and training travelers who came to here had already started. And then later in India, they grew and are famous now in history. Nalanda and some other universities were in India. So the last words of the Buddha, the very last thing he said, and so he was teaching right up until he died, and he said, "Subject to change are all component things. Strive on with heedfulness." So he was telling his students one more time that all component beings like us, like every living thing, were made up of parts. You can't really figure out where you are, because all the different parts we are any separate part doesn't tell us who we are. But he told them there will always be all component things, all living beings are subject to change. So strive on heedfully. So that image of needing the effort and the energy to follow the path, right up until the last thing he said, he talked about that. And that everything changes, everything is impermanent. And so work right up till the end. So now, I would like to quickly go over the Four Noble Truths because our time is getting short. So here are the four truths that you've been waiting for. But now you know what a big effort it took for him to get these, and no one else had made this connection of any of the teachers that he had. The first is the truth of suffering. So we've talked about that, the truth of dukkha. And that's just that there's an unsatisfactory nature to all life, we talk about phenomenal existence, but to all life, that impermanence creates dissatisfaction. So that dukkha is bigger than just, well, I don't feel good about, I don't like what I had for dinner today, so I'm going to be irritated. That dissatisfaction is part of the nature of this life, our life and other life. So that dukkha is part of this world. So that's part of what we encounter as a human being. And the cause of it, though, is not the dukkha itself, because that's really part of the nature of the world. But the cause of our suffering is because we hang on to those things that are impermanent, that are always changing. So we try to make something that's impermanent be permanent. So it's not desire, and sometimes people will say desire is the cause for suffering, but desire is part of our human nature and animal nature, because we desire things. We desire our children to be healthy, and we desire that we live a long life, and that we can desire is not really inappropriate for who we are, but the pain comes from wanting to stay attached to all that stuff. We create, our thirst is unquenchable, you know? We can't be satisfied, so we want to hang on to everything. If something's good, you know, we want more of it. So it's like chocolate cake or just chocolate. Forget about the cake. If we love it, our tendency is probably to eat more than is really good for us. Or you know, we may have to not eat it at all because we know if we get started, we'll finish the whole bag or the whole bar. So this nature of wanting to attach to things because it's good, or because we're comfortable with it, or because we don't want it to change, it's impossible to do that without suffering. So the suffering comes from not our nature, but from our trying to grasp on too hard and not lose it. So that's the second truth. And the third truth is that there is an end to suffering. And the Buddha believed that even with our mental states, because he believed in this, the conditionality of everything, that so if one thing happens, then something else happens as a result of it, that you can also end that cycle. So if this thing ends, the other thing connected to it will end. And so he believed that unwholesome, unskillful mental states could be permanently transformed, eliminated through the practice. And there are still a lot of people who don't agree with that, but I think the Buddha saw with his own life and with his enlightenment experience that it could be. And then the Noble Eightfold Path, he believed, could do that. So I know several people who will still say, well, you can get rid of a lot of things maybe, but you can't get rid of anger. Like, anger is an evolutionary survival skill, you know. It's or we can sometimes maybe it's good to be angry, like you need to be angry or you might get stepped on. And I think the Buddha was saying, the Buddha believed we're not stuck with ourselves as a kind of a jungle person. We're evolutionizing our minds with his teachings. So we can get rid of fear, and we can get rid of anger, and we can get rid of all the things that we think of as disturbing emotions or difficult emotions, that they can be eradicated. He talked about we can pull them out by the roots, but it takes that heedfulness and that determination. So that there is an end to suffering, and then the fourth truth is that the practice path for that, to get to the end of suffering, is what he calls the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path has 3 different sections. So it's on a wheel, so it's hard to say where it starts or where it ends, because you're always going. But when we talk about it, we start with the first component is called, and it comes up at the end, but it's wisdom. And the second is that the ethical questions and the questions of morality that we call sila, but it's morality. That's the second section of the Noble Eightfold Path, because it's so important. Because so I'll talk about what they all include. But then the third part of the path is where he talks about our meditation, and that includes not only mindfulness practice, but then also those meditative stages that he went through, those stages where we get closer to that ultimate truth ourselves. So the wisdom components are right view and right intention. And so we always use the word right. And I've been researching that word so much, if there's a better word to use, and I'm just kind of stuck with that, because right when I think I can, people will change it and say, well, use the word appropriate. So appropriate view and appropriate intention. But I think the Buddha really meant, if you want to have that cessation of suffering, if you want to be able to do what I discovered, it is, the word right is the right word, because these are the things you would have to do to reach that point of ending all suffering. So right view, which is understanding and accepting the Four Noble Truths, is a big part of it, to buy into that. Like, I'm going to discover this for myself, but this makes sense, and now I want to be on the path to discover it for myself. So that's where we begin with right view. Like, okay, this path may not get me where I want to go, but I'm going to buy into it. I'm going to be confident about it at this point, and start doing it. Do it myself. And right intention is always having the purest intentions of doing no harm to yourself or to others, and to always, whatever you do, to do with compassion and to do with loving kindness. So harmlessness and loving kindness and compassion should be always where your intention is in whatever you do. And then the next 3 are morality, and those are with our speech, right speech, and then right action. And speech is really important, because once we say something that we later regret, it sets its own wheel in motion of, we've hurt someone, we get in a fight, or we say something that misleads someone, or We don't tell the truth. So our speech, what actually comes out of our mouth, is very important. The Buddha has there are more precepts about speech than any other. And then right livelihood is also, and that's the work we do. And the Buddha had some specific occupations. He didn't want people to be involved in slavery, selling or buying slaves, or working, killing animals, or working with poisons or weapons, firearms. But we know today there are other things about our livelihood. We can have a perfectly okay job. Pretty much, that's not so hard. Any job can be an ethical job, but we may be spending too much time at work and making our family putting our family on hold when maybe they need more of our time, or we can be, we can have the wrong focus in our work, or we can be angry all the time at work and hate our job and bring that home. So we can decide for ourselves if right livelihood is being practiced by the way we handle our job. And I think that's something that we have to think about too. But any kind of livelihood that doesn't allow you to follow the precepts or allow you to have the kind of morality that does, our morality is like doing no harm to others or to ourselves. So we've got to be careful about that. And it's tricky when we have IRAs that are invested in things that we don't even know what's being done. So, what?
Bitcoin.
Now we try to make sure that the way we're spending our money, is done ethically. So it's not an easy task. I think it just gets harder and harder. So after right livelihood, so those are the three from morality: speech and action, just our bodily actions, and our livelihood. And then the third division is, we call it concentration or meditation, and it starts off with effort. And it's in the section. Some people will talk about, well, you just need effort to live this life, but I think specifically it was to meditate takes effort. I mean, you have to make the decision. You're going to make that time to do it, and if it's not a lot of fun every day, that you're still going to make the time to do it. So it takes effort to actually have a meditation practice. So that's the main area I think he was talking about. And then the next is mindfulness, and that's our meditation when we're trying to be present and just be aware of be aware of ourselves. We're learning, we're aware of ourselves, we're aware of what's going on, we're learning to pay attention and to stay focused. And then samadhi is the word for concentration. That's the third one, and that would include being in that quieter, more still place and staying with it. So and then you start over again, then your view becomes broader because your meditation has given you insights to that first wisdom you started with. And your intention becomes clearer, and then you just keep, you're on the wheel. And if we do that, the Buddha's promise is that we can achieve what he did, and that it's possible. And life can be happy. We still have pain. We still experience pain and sickness and old age and death. There's no magic about that. But we don't have to suffer, because one thing that we typically do when we're hanging on to that stuff and grabbing onto it, when we do lose it, it's just, sometimes it's grieving that we never get over. So we don't accept it. Like, it's a natural part of life that we're all going to die. We're going to die. Everything we love will die. And the more we accept just the nature of reality, the more we can live with peace within the world that we have. And realize, part of what I've been practicing recently, when something upsets me, and I've had a few things that have upset me lately, and I've been able to think about, and I'm also 69, so I'm getting really close to being 70. And it's, life is really short. And I figure maybe I've got 10 good years, like my mom's 93, so I might push it, but 10 good years where I can still hear and still see and maybe have my mind left. That just, in my head, that's my math. But I think if I only have those 10 good years left, why would I want to spend it getting caught up in, but he said this and then she said this and that. Why would I want to do that? And it makes it, that's an advantage to getting older. It makes it much easier to let things go. Because I think what's more important to me now is would it be to sit and meditate or take a walk and be out in nature and or read a book that I'm really interested in studying or listening to a talk? Or would it be to just sit here and get all steamed up about somebody who did something that I'm not happy about? I mean, that includes even politicians. I mean, is it real? What's it worth? And the last few days, the last week, it's like I wake up and there's stuff that I don't want to hear about that in my email box from NPR telling me all these terrible things. So I have to make a decision at some point in the day. How much am I going to stay with that feeling in my gut that the world is not right now? The world's never been right, and we all have to do what we can to change it. But we don't have a lot of time, and the more we recognize that, the happier we can be, and the more we recognize that our loved ones, we won't always have them, and we won't always have that cake that we're hiding in the freezer or that somebody made for us yesterday, that'll be gone. And then we either accept it or we get really unhappy and suffer a lot.
Thank you for this teaching. My question is, could you say something about what is, for a lay person, what is a wholesome and skillful way to practice the middle way in our society?
Well, that's a good question. I think that's the question we all face. Someone called me just yesterday and said, what is there that I can buy or join or pay for that can help protect me from a lot of negative people I work with? If I had it to sell to him, I'd have a stack of them right here selling them to you. But he was very sincere, and he had other teachers who had said things to him like, if you buy this, or if you join my group, or if you, that he really thought that there might be something that I could sell to him, or that he could join, and he was willing to pay for it. I mean, but he was very sincere, because he said he really wants to be on a path, but it's so hard for him because of the behavior of people he works with. And I didn't really want to ask him too much about where he worked, but it sounded like an unhealthy place. But I said there's nothing you can buy or join, but what you have to do is practice. You have to have a lot. Start with faith, that this path could work, that these four truths make sense, and give it a shot, and then have a lot of, then that faith can become confidence as we start developing wisdom and as we start seeing the fruits of our meditation practice. And I think we just have to keep doing it. It's like washing our dirty clothes. We have to wash our own dirty clothes, right? I know some of you probably have someone who washes yours, but then you have to come up with a different image. But we have to keep washing them, right? Over and over and over again. But I think the number one thing that the Buddha would say, that he did say many times, noble friends are friends who are also on the path. Having noble friends is the number one thing, the number one part of this whole picture that and he said it is all the path, because his student, who was also his secretary, which meant he memorized everything the Buddha taught. He didn't write it down, he just memorized it all. But he asked him, what's the most important part of what you're teaching? And the Buddha told him, it's having noble friends. So I think that's the best answer. You need to always have people that you can go to, who you can be honest with and talk to them, say, I'm having a hard time with this or that, and they'll be honest back, but that you share a spiritual path with. It can't be your best friend at a bar, I'm sad to say, because that's probably not the best place to get really good, solid spiritual advice. But you need those people who will be loving and kind, but also honest. So if they say, well, have you looked at, maybe they know you well enough to know something that's kind of out of sync. But does that help?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you would think that suffering would actually be eliminated in the near future, like I do, that virtually most suffering through technology, and like the Buddha said that eventually, suffering will hopefully be eliminated. So I don't know, it's a temporary thing, suffering is just a thing in our journey to an evolution of the spirit. But do you think that's a possibility that suffering will end in our near future? And also, I think it is suffering. Every decade there's less suffering as a percentage, less people are starving. So actually, we are progressing towards that, of zero suffering.
Oh, I think yeah.
And as far as the media, that's perpetuating the suffering, I think, and that.
I think that the reason
think about it.
Well, if computers could do it, I don't think that's the suffering.
General technology, GMOs.
Well, the suffering that the Buddha's talking about is I don't think I think it's part of the world. It's part of this earth. It's a part of like people will always die, so we'll always lose people we love. We'll always die. That's not going to change.
Everyone agrees that that's our future.
Okay, well, yeah.
They won't die.
I've listened to some of those talks, and I think they have a great desire to not. I mean, I'm not going to say it about all scientists at all, but when I hear some of the talks about extending life, that's a desire to not suffer. That they are hanging on to, like their scientific tools. That's like somebody saying, I'm going to love this person beyond this life, right? We're soulmates, and it's that wanting to extend life and all of that can be just as much tanha, just as much clinging and attachment as is our wanting to cling to the things that we love. So it's not really different.
So we're destined to suffer?
We're what?
We're destined to suffer no matter what?
I think in this world, the way it exists, it's that suffering, we can be destined, but we can get off of that wheel of suffering by accepting by accepting the nature of this world. If we truly accept the nature of this world, we'll go home and love everybody in our house, even if we're really upset with them, because they're not going to be around long. I mean, no matter how, humans don't live very long, right? Even the oldest. Life is short, and then we die. And the Buddha was focused on, he focused a lot of his teachings on, because of the nature of this world, it's very important that we live now, not in the future, not in the past, but that we live now and really not only enjoy and love the people that we're around and be helpful and be compassionate towards all beings, but we can find happiness in the present moment and in now. But we don't have any guarantees about tomorrow, and what happened yesterday is already gone. So he would say, no, the suffering is our choice. Suffering is, now pain has probably been lessened in this world because of medicine and technology and science, but suffering is probably as great now as it's ever been, maybe more. Suffering is the thing we have a choice about, because we can choose to accept the nature of the world and to live with that and be happy in the world that we have.